The cold steel of handcuffs locked around Judge Naomi Carter's wrists as Officer Mark Dalton barked that her Mercedes was stolen. A black federal judge humiliated in broad daylight, her federal ID shining in her hand, proof he refused to see. Even then, Naomi stood tall, determined not to bow to injustice. The crowd gasped, torn between outrage and disbelief. What happens when a woman of the law turns the tables on a racist cop before everyone's eyes? If this moment stirs anger or empathy, hit like and share. Let's dive into the full story together. I was 2 cars back when the siren split the morning open. Blue and red strobed across the storefront windows, sliding over the black Mercedes that had been gliding along like every other commuter car. It eased to the curb with a calm, practiced signal. No sudden moves, nothing reckless. Then the police cruiser door slammed, and Officer Mark Dalton came out like a man already certain of the ending. Hand on his holster, chin high, shoulders squared like a verdict. He didn't ask for a license. He didn't introduce himself. He marched to the driver's window and barked, "Step out of the vehicle." "This car's flag stolen." The woman behind the wheel didn't flinch. I recognized her in the mirror before he did. Judge Naomi Carter. Black federal judge. Former Army intel. Around here, people call her the kind of fair that makes everyone a little better. She lowered the window in slow motion, the kind that says, "I know exactly how fast my hands need to move if I want to live." "Good morning, officer," she said, steady and even voice of someone who has told a jury to sit and a lawyer to stop talking. No tremble, no panic, just a calm that made my stomach twist. Dalton leaned in shadow, cutting across her face. "Out, now." Phones popped up around me like prairie grass after rain. A delivery guy killed his engine and stared. Pedestrians paused mid-step, heads turning the way people do right before a bad thing becomes a story. You could feel the street tighten. "I'm going to retrieve my identification," Naomi said, clear, deliberate. "My wallet is in my handbag." Mid-climax snapped into place. "Don't move." Dalton's hand climbed higher on his weapon. The word cracked through the block so hard a woman on the sidewalk yelped. Hands where I can see them, Naomi froze. Not shaking, frozen like a steel beam. She lifted both hands into view, palms open to the morning. Her eyes flicked to the rear view, and for a heartbeat I saw her see herself, a black woman in a nice car. A white cop with a temper, a dozen lenses pointed at the two of them, like witnesses and weapons all at once. From somewhere behind me, a voice said, "Isn't that Judge Carter?" Then another, "That's Judge Carter." Then a third, flat with disbelief. He knows, he has to know. He didn't, or he didn't care. Dalton scanned the roofline, the seats, the floorboard, everywhere but her eyes. "Vehicle matches a stolen report," he said. "Step out, step back, hands on the hood." "Officer," Naomi answered, "I'm on my way to preside over a disciplinary hearing. I will show you my federal identification." The light at the corner turned yellow, then red, but nobody drove. Engines idled. The block became a theater, and Naomi, still calm, made a choice in front of all of us. Very slowly, she angled her right hand toward the handbag. "My ID," she said, "is inside." Ma'am Dalton's voice broke at the edges. "Do not reach." She stopped, exhaled, then louder so every phone could catch it. "Officer, with your permission, I am retrieving my federal identification." No answer, just that pressed thin line of his mouth and a twitch in his jaw. "I'm giving you a lawful instruction," he said finally. "Exit the vehicle." She didn't argue. She didn't sermonize. She simply looked straight ahead at her own reflection in the mirror and lifted her chin a fraction. The smallest act of defiance I've ever seen. The kind that happens inside a person before the rest of the world notices. Later I would try to explain the next seconds and fail because sound does strange things when fear walks in. Tires hissed. Someone coughed. A school kid whispered, "What's happening to nobody?" The sun flashed off the chrome like a camera bulb. And over it all, Naomi's voice calm as a metronome. "Officer, for the record, I am Judge Naomi Carter. I intend to comply. I will step out slowly." She cracked the door with 2 fingers, kept her left hand high, and unfolded herself onto the asphalt like she was stepping onto a courtroom floor. Shoulders back, head steady, composure wrapped tight as a robe. Dalton shuffled her back toward the hood with a gesture too fast, too sharp. Hands on the vehicle. She set her palms on the warm metal. The street held its breath. He glanced at the roof cams, the phones, the faces. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "Since you insist," Naomi said, still facing the hood, "my federal identification is in the handbag on the passenger seat. Your vehicle," he snapped, "is reported stolen." "Then check the report," a man near me muttered. "Check anything." Dalton didn't. He radioed something clipped and hard eyes never leaving her. The cruiser's lights kept pulsing, and it felt like time pulsed with them, blue, red, steady as a threat. A city bus rolled to a stop at the corner. People pressed to the glass. A teenager outside lifted his phone higher and said low, "We see you, ma'am." Naomi didn't turn, but I watched the way her spine settled a notch deeper, the way a soldier squares to the line. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't argued the law with a man who didn't want it. But I could feel the calculus inside her, that private ledger of risk and dignity. Later I would think it sounded like this: "If I bow my head today, millions will be diminished tomorrow." Another siren. A second cruiser slid in, hot tires chirping. The curb crowded. A woman with a stroller rocked it with one foot, eyes wide. A cyclist laid his bike down and stood with his arms folded, camera steady as a tripod. Dalton took a half step closer to Naomi's shoulder, enough to make me clench my jaw. "Any sudden movement," he said, and he didn't finish. Maybe he didn't have to. We all knew the end of that sentence. Naomi spoke to the metal beneath her hands, to the street, to all of us. "Officer, I will not resist. I will provide identification." Her voice did something to the crowd. The murmurs dropped away. Even the babies on the bus went quiet, as if the city itself wanted to hear the next line. She lifted one hand an inch off the hood. Dalton's fingers flexed at his holster. "Permission to retrieve my ID," she said. "Now." Long beat. Too long. The siren's echo washed off the buildings. Across the street, a delivery driver mouthed, "Please say yes." Dalton's eyes bounced from her hand to the phones, to the badge number on his own chest. His breath hitched. "Don't," he said, half command, half fear. Naomi's palm kissed the hood again. She nodded once, so small you'd miss it if you blinked. "Very well," she said. "Then I will wait." That was when the second climax began to coil, quiet, tight, and mean. From behind us, a fresh set of lights spilled over the block. Another unit. Doors opening. Radio chatter. The kind of movement that says, this is no longer a stop. This is a spectacle. Dalton leaned in toward Naomi's ear, voice low but razor sharp. "You're not special. You hear me?" She didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead, past her own reflection, toward the courthouse dome just visible above the rooftops. "I hear you," she said. "And so does everyone else." The crowd shifted, a tide turning. "Officer," someone called out. She said she has ID. He whipped around, scanning faces, cameras, witnesses he couldn't control. When he turned back, his jaw was set for the next move. "Ma'am," he said loud enough for every lens on the block, "step back and place your hands." He reached toward his cuffs, and every phone on that street stopped breathing. From where I stood, I could see her hands steady, open, deliberate. Judge Naomi Carter didn't rush, didn't fumble. She spoke loud enough for the microphones in every phone to catch. "I'm going to retrieve my identification," she said. "My wallet is in my handbag." She moved her right hand a few inches toward the passenger seat. "Don't move, officer." Mark Dalton's voice cracked like a whip. He snapped his palm higher on his holster and stepped in tight, as if she just pulled a knife instead of a sentence. Around me, shoulders tensed and breath caught. It was the kind of command that doesn't leave room for common sense. The second officer, young, clean-shaven, still wearing the nerves of a rookie, came up on Naomi's blindside. His name tag read Price. He looked at Naomi, then at Dalton, and his face worked through a dozen calculations at once. Not defiance, caution, not courage, conscience trying to find an exit. "Maybe we should verify ID first," he said low, almost swallowed by the noise. Dalton didn't even glance at him. "I gave an order." Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't shrink either. "Officer," she said, "with your permission, I will take out my federal identification now." She opened her handbag the distance of a breath and drew out a leather wallet. When she unfolded it, the morning sun caught the embossed seal gold winking like a flare. You could hear phones zoom and focus. She held it chest-high angled so the cameras and the officers could see the photo, the title, the authority of it. "Federal judge," someone behind me murmured. "It's her. It's Judge Carter." Another voice answered sharper. "That's Judge Naomi Carter. He can't, he won't. Dalton cut through the murmurs with a scowl. Could be fake, he said. No inspection, no request to hold it, just dismissal. Pop the trunk. A hush spread in a widening ring, like a siren with no sound. The disrespect landed harder than the accusation. Not because we worship titles around here, but because truth was staring him in the face, and he blinked on purpose. Naomi held the ID steady. This is my federal credential. I am on my way to court. Pop the trunk, Dalton repeated each word a hammer. Hands back on the hood. Price's throat bobbed. Sarge, we can scan the number. Do your job, Dalton snapped, eyes never leaving Naomi. On the sidewalk, a woman whispered to her husband, he doesn't want to see it. The husband answered, he's decided already. Those two lines felt like a verdict on more than one morning. Naomi's arm didn't waver. She could have argued the law-cited procedures reminded him that verification is a 30-second call. She didn't. She kept it simple, human, impossible to misunderstand. My identification is valid. You may verify it. Dalton smiled without warmth. Open the trunk. The cruelty wasn't in the words. It was in the refusal to recognize a fact because it didn't serve the story he'd already written. I've seen men get louder when the truth gets bright. This was that. Bright truth. Louder, man. A delivery driver leaned out his window and called officer. The badge, look at the badge. Another commuter honked once, not impatient, indignant. Phones lifted higher. A teenager near the bus stop cupped his hands and shouted, "We're recording." Dalton's gaze flicked to the crowd, irritation not caution, then back to Naomi. Place the ID on the hood and step away. Naomi set the wallet gently on the metal, as if she were laying a hand on a sacred text. You can read it, officer. He didn't touch it. Trunk. Price took half a step forward, then faltered, eyes dropping to the seal on the credential. Up close, it was undeniable. You could almost see the thought cross his face. If I ignore this, who am I? He cleared his throat. Sir, I can radio the number to dispatch 2 minutes. A muscle in Dalton's jaw jumped. We're not doing a ceremony. We're recovering a stolen vehicle. Stolen. A man to my left laughed without humor. From who its owner, Naomi's voice found the space between fury and grace. You are detaining a federal judge in public view after being offered proof. Please verify the ID. Around us, sounds swelled the soft roar of a crowd choosing a side. People weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing. There's a difference. Witnessing demands memory. Dalton took another step, his shadow swallowing the wallet. Last time he said, "Open the trunk." The balance of the moment teetered. If Naomi yielded, she would survive the minute and lose something larger. If she refused, the risk climbed. She did what only a person born for a bench and forged in harder rooms can do. She made the smallest possible stand with the largest possible meaning. No, she said, quiet but final. You may verify my identification. The word hung there. No, not as defiance for its own sake, but as a line that kept the rest of us human. Dalton's nostrils flared. He dropped his hand from the holster to the radio mic and squeezed. Unit 12 to dispatch suspect refusing commands at Maple and 5th. Possible stolen vehicle recovery. Send additional units. Price's eyes widened. Sir, she's not refusing. She's asking for verification. Write that on your evaluation, Dalton shot back. The crowd edged closer to the curb, drawn as if by gravity. A little boy tugged his mother's sleeve. Mom, why won't he look? The mother didn't answer. Her face was the answer. Naomi lifted her gaze not to Dalton, but to us strangers who had just become jurors. There was something like sorrow in her eyes and something like resolve. When she spoke, she gave the street a sentence to remember. I will not bow to a lie. A woman near me whispered, God help us, and made the sign of the cross. The teenager's hands shook as he filmed. The delivery driver muttered, this is going everywhere. Sirens wailed again. A third car turned the corner lights, chewing up the distance. The stage enlarged. The pressure mounted. Truth didn't matter less under that pressure. It mattered more. That was the worst part and the hopeful part at once. Dalton pointed at the wallet without looking at it. Back away from the vehicle. Naomi stepped back one pace, hands visible dignity intact. You may pick it up, she said. He didn't. He stared over it, threw it past it, as if refusing to touch it might make it less real. Then louder for the cameras, he claimed not to see ma'am comply with instructions or what a voice called. Not taunting tired, or what Officer Price swallowed. Sir, I can verify right now. He lifted his shoulder mic. Dispatch, do you copy? Dalton shot him a look that could freeze water. Price's thumb hesitated over the button, then fell away. A bus door hissed open. People stepped down and joined the edge of the sidewalk, phone screens glowing like a necklace of tiny moons. The city had formed a circle ancient as any ring where truth and power test each other. Naomi nodded once as if to herself. She wasn't playing to us. She was anchoring herself. Officer, she said, I will comply with any lawful command. Verify the ID. The wallet gleamed on the hood between them like a dare from the truth. Dalton stared at it, then past it, then at the crowd, always the crowd. Maybe he sensed the ground shifting under his boots. Maybe that's why his voice got harder when his position got weaker. Turn around, he said. Hands behind your back. The block inhaled in one long, horrified breath. I felt my fingers go numb. Somewhere a car horn blared and died. Naomi didn't plead. She didn't flinch. She turned slowly, deliberately, until she faced the street, until we could all see her face, and we could all see his. This is wrong, Price said, the words slipping out before he could catch them. Dalton ignored him. Metal flashed. In the mirror of the Mercedes, I watched Naomi's eyes hold steady as the cuffs came out again, and I heard my own voice before I knew I'd spoken. Look at the ID, I said, useless and necessary. He didn't, and the truth, bright as it was, hung there for one more impossible second, ignored, recorded, and about to change everything. The sound hit like a hammer metal, striking metal, as Officer Dalton snapped the cuffs around Judge Naomi Carter's wrists. It wasn't just the clink of steel, it was the gasp that followed, rippling through the crowd. Phones tilted higher, fingers scrambled to zoom in. The moment a federal judge was shackled on a city street had been captured, sealed in memory and video, before anyone could process what had just happened. Naomi didn't fight. She didn't twist or resist. Her back straightened, shoulders, squared chin lifted. She stood like she was standing in her own courtroom, though her hands were bound before her. The cuffs glinted against her dark skin, a sight so wrong it made people on the sidewalk cover their mouths. I swear in that instant she seemed to drift somewhere else, her eyes fixed not on Dalton, not on the crowd, but far beyond, into memory. I imagined what she saw: a younger Naomi, 20 years old, sitting in a law school lecture hall, her hand raised to ask a question. A professor's voice, smooth but condescending, telling her maybe she should focus on family law, not constitutional theory. It might suit you better, he had said. The unspoken words weighed heavier because you are a black woman and this arena is not for you. That sting had never left her. And behind it, another voice, her mother's from their kitchen table years earlier. Naomi, you study law so no one can ever chain us with lies. You fight so no one dares trample us again. The flashback faded. Here she was, chained anyway, not by truth, but by arrogance. And still she refused to bow her head. Dalton's voice sliced through the air. Additional units requested. Suspect detained. Stand by for transport. His radio crackled in response, dispatch confirming backup en route. It wasn't procedure anymore. It was theater. Blue lights bounced off windows, off faces, off the polished Mercedes now surrounded like contraband. People leaned out of car windows. A cyclist stopped mid-pedal and propped his bike on the curb, recording. A mother pushed her stroller back against the wall, clutching her child closer. Dalton stood tall, chest puffed, scanning the crowd as if daring anyone to challenge his authority. To him, Naomi wasn't a judge, wasn't a veteran, wasn't a human being with credentials still gleaming on the hood of her car. She was a suspect because he needed her to be. The crowd's murmurs turned into sharp whispers. That's Judge Carter. He knows. He has to know. Then from the middle of the sidewalk, a child's voice cut through the noise, clear, innocent, devastating. Mom, the boy said, tugging at her sleeve. Why are they tying her up? Isn't she a judge? The mother bent low, whispering something I couldn't hear. Her face told the truth, her words couldn't soften, because sometimes the robe doesn't matter. Because sometimes skin speaks louder than titles. That one question from a child did what no legal argument could. It pierced through the layers of procedure, pride, and protocol. The people closest to the scene fell silent, eyes shifting from Dalton to Naomi, from the cuffs to the badge, still untouched on the car. Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough that we could see her face. No tears, no fear, only resolve. She looked at the boy, then at the crowd. Her eyes said, "Remember this. Don't look away." Dalton, oblivious or unwilling, pressed forward. "Step back," he barked, shoving Naomi lightly against the hood. The steel cuffs rattled against the metal, loud as a verdict. I noticed at Officer Price then. He had been standing at the edge of it all, hands clenched and jaw tight. His gaze darted between Dalton's aggression and Naomi's unyielding calm. You could see the conflict tearing at him, loyalty to a partner versus loyalty to the oath he swore. Sweat broke at his temple, even in the morning chill. His lips parted once like he wanted to speak, but the words died before they reached the air. For Price, the struggle was private but brutal. For Naomi, it was public and merciless. The second patrol car roared in sirens, screaming lights spinning. Doors opened, officers spilled out. The scene looked less like a traffic stop and more like the takedown of a fugitive. Cameras captured it all, lenses hungry for the clash of power and truth. Naomi stood in the middle of it, hands cuffed, posture unbroken. Even as Dalton called for more backup, she carried herself like the one person in control. That quiet dignity clashed so violently with the image of the cuffs that I felt the unfairness burn in my chest. People whispered around me, not just angry but shaken. They knew they'd remember where they stood, what they saw when justice itself was cuffed in daylight. And Naomi, bound and humiliated, remained what she had always been, a judge. Not because of the badge on the hood, not because of the robe waiting for her in the courthouse, but because of the way she refused to let her spirit bend. That was the moment we all understood. This was no longer about one stop, one cop, or one car. This was a judgment unfolding in real time, and the jury was every set of eyes watching from the curb. The crowd had already grown thick, a living wall of eyes and raised phones. Engines idled, bus doors stayed open. People whispered names they half remembered. Judge Naomi Carter, wasn't it? The tension was close to snapping when a new sound cut through the chaos, the slam of another car door, heavier, sharper, carrying authority in its echo. Captain Laura Hayes stepped onto the pavement. You could tell right away she wasn't there to spectate. Shoulders squared, her uniform pressed crisp, her presence alone slowed the noise of the street. She walked toward the scene with purpose, not rushing, not timid, just steady enough to make every eye follow. "Officer Dalton," she called, her tone clipped, leaving no room for debate. "What's your procedure here?" Dalton stiffened. His hand twitched near his radio. Vehicle flag stolen. Suspect refusing full compliance. Suspect Hayes stopped just short of him, gaze cutting like glass. "She's handcuffed in broad daylight, credentials untouched on the hood, and you're still calling her a suspect. Explain." Dalton opened his mouth, but Hayes was already moving. She turned to Naomi's handbag, which lay half open on the passenger seat. With deliberate care, she reached in. The crowd leaned forward, phones rising higher. From the bag, she pulled 2 items, a driver's license and a federal judicial ID. She held them up where the sun caught the gold seal. The air thickened. For the first time since the stop began, a sound of recognition rippled louder this time, less whisper and more chorus. "This," Hayes declared, voice pitched for every microphone and camera, "is Judge Naomi Carter of the Federal District Court. This vehicle is not reported stolen. These credentials are valid." The reaction was immediate. Gasps, shouts. Some cursed under their breath. Others held their phones higher, live streaming her words into the world beyond this block. The truth once denied now shone in the open, undeniable as daylight. Naomi lifted her chin, her wrists still bound, her dignity intact. Dalton's jaw worked. His face flushed, but his words came out the same, stubborn, sharp, brittle. "Could be forged. I still have the right to pursue investigation." The crowd erupted in disbelief. "Forged?" someone barked. "You've lost your mind." Hayes's eyes narrowed, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of rank. "What you're doing, officer, is not an investigation. It's humiliation. And not just of her. You're humiliating this department, this badge, and the authority of a federal court." She paused, letting the silence work. "Right here in front of witnesses." Dalton turned toward her, defiance etched into every line of his stance. "Captain, with respect, There is no respect in what you've done. Hayes's tone cut him off sharper than a siren. You are standing on the neck of justice, and you don't even see it. The crowd pressed closer, drawn not just by the spectacle, but by the weight of her words. Phones trembled in hands as people tried to capture every second. Even the rookie officer Price shifted from foot to foot, shame flashing across his young face. Dalton clenched his fists. She matches the description of the vehicle. No, Hayes snapped, pointing to the documents still gleaming in her hand. This car is a Mercedes. The report was for a stolen BMW. Plates don't match. Make all the excuses you want, but the facts don't lie. You are wrong, and you know it. Naomi stood silent, eyes on Hayes, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. Two women in uniforms of different kinds bound by a single understanding authority means nothing without principle. Dalton looked from Hayes to the crowd to the phones aimed at him like rifles of truth, but he didn't step back. He shook his head, voice raised once more, though cracks showed now in the steel of it. I still have grounds to detain her until I'm satisfied. Satisfied, as if the crowd's witness, the credentials in Hayes's hands, and the very truth itself were not enough. Hayes straightened. Her words came low and final. Officer Dalton, you are not protecting this city. You are endangering it. You are not enforcing the law. You are trampling it. And if you do not release Judge Carter now, the only thing you'll be detaining is your own career. For a heartbeat, the street froze. The silence felt heavier than the noise had. 1,000 breaths held waiting. Naomi's eyes swept the crowd, steady, unwavering, the kind of gaze that binds witnesses to history. The cuffs still cut her wrists, but her posture told a different story. She wasn't the one on trial. Dalton's face burned, his authority shrinking with each camera lens fixed on him. Yet still he stood stubborn, unwilling to yield. The moment stretched. The air itself felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter. And in that fragile silence, you could feel it, the turn. Something was about to break, and it wouldn't be Naomi Carter. Naomi Carter did not shrink from the cuffs digging into her wrists. Instead, she lifted her chin and raised the federal ID high above her head, holding it steady so every lens could see. The gold seal caught the sunlight, a flare of truth across a street drowning in suspicion. Her voice cut through the noise, calm yet commanding. I am Judge Naomi Carter. Federal District Court. The effect was immediate. The crowd, restless moments before, erupted in unison. She's a judge, someone shouted. Release her now, another cried. Then voices joined into a rolling chant. Let her go, that's Judge Carter. The street became a chorus of outraged disbelief and defiance. Phones shook in raised hands, live streams buzzed across social feeds, and the raw force of public judgment turned against the officer who refused to see what was right in front of him. Even a child's voice pierced the uproar, thin but determined. She's a judge. Dalton spun on his heel, his face a mask of rage and panic. His voice cracked as he tried to shout over the chaos. Quiet, everyone, back away. This is police business. But no one moved. Authority had shifted, and he stood on the wrong side of it. Captain Hayes stepped closer, her presence steady as a gavel strike. She didn't raise her voice, but her words carried like a verdict. Officer Dalton, you've just ended your career. Remove those cuffs. Hand over your weapon and your badge here now. The silence that followed was louder than the shouting had been. Dalton blinked as if the command itself were unthinkable. His face flushed red, then drained pale. You can't strip me like this. Not here. Not in front of I can. Hayes interrupted her stare, sharp as glass, and I just did. Cuff removal. Immediately. Dalton's mouth twisted, desperation leaking through. This is a setup. You're humiliating me. No, Hayes replied, her voice cold and clear. You humiliated yourself. The world is watching because you forced it to. All eyes turned to the rookie officer Price. His hands shook as he stepped forward, fumbling with the key at his belt. Dalton barked, "Don't you touch her," but the order fell flat, drowned beneath the crowd's chant. The key slid into place. With a sharp metallic snap, the cuffs fell open. The sound was electric. The block erupted, cheers, applause, fists pumping the air. The chant shifted, justice. Justice horns honked from idling cars. People stamped the pavement, and for the first time that morning, the noise belonged to hope. Naomi's arms dropped free. She didn't rub her wrists or step back. She straightened to her full height, lifting the ID once more for the cameras and for the witnesses who would carry this moment far beyond the street. "The law will not be silenced by lies," she said. Her words echoed against glass, and concrete burned into every phone recording etched into memory. Dalton staggered back, his authority unraveling in front of strangers and colleagues alike. His badge glinted under the sun, suddenly small, suddenly meaningless. Hayes extended her hand, palm open, immovable. Badge. Gun. Now. He froze, his jaw clenched. For a moment it looked as if he might resist. The crowd leaned in, every lens trained on his humiliation. His breath hitched, his hand trembled, and then defeat. With a sharp motion, he ripped the badge from his chest and slapped it into Hayes's palm. His gun followed, heavier, final. His shoulders sagged, his eyes hollow. Naomi stood tall, framed by the roar of the people. Dalton shrank, stripped of authority, not in some closed office, but in the raw daylight of a city street. That was the turning point, the collapse on the spot. And in that moment it was clear justice hadn't waited for the courthouse. It had arrived right there in front of us all, undeniable and unforgettable. Dalton's face twisted crimson, his chest heaving as the roar of the crowd closed in around him. The badge and gun Hayes had taken still burned in his memory, his pride ripped away in front of every stranger, every camera. His voice cracked with fury, echoing across the street. "You're destroying me," he bellowed, spit flying. "All of you, you're ruining my life." He jerked forward and tried to snatch the badge back from Hayes' hand. For a split second, the crowd gasped, the air sharp with the threat of violence. But Hayes didn't flinch. Her voice rang steady, cutting through the chaos like the strike of a bell. "Step back, Dalton. You hold no power here anymore." Her calm was sharper than any shout. Dalton froze, eyes, wild, hands trembling, as if still reaching for authority that no longer existed. The weight of the silence pressed harder than the chance. And then, sudden, reckless, he lunged. Not toward Hayes this time, but toward Naomi. The street shrieked alive. Phones jerked higher. A woman cried out. Naomi didn't move, didn't retreat. She stood, rooted, chin lifted, as if daring him to finish what he'd started. But before Dalton could close the distance, a figure stepped between them. Officer Daniel Price. His arm shot out, palm braced against Dalton's chest, stopping him cold. His voice, usually soft and uncertain, now carried like thunder. "Enough, Mark. This ends now." The crowd roared, a single breath of relief and fire. Dalton's mouth fell open, stunned not by Naomi's defiance this time, but by his own partner's betrayal. Price squared his shoulders, every ounce of hesitation burned away. He looked straight into Dalton's furious eyes, then turned toward Naomi, his voice rising so every phone, every witness could hear. "I'm sorry, Judge Carter," he said, loud and unwavering. "I choose the Constitution. I will not choose silence." The words struck deeper than the handcuffs, deeper than the badge stripped away. For the first time all morning, Dalton stumbled backward, not from force, but from truth. The crowd erupted. "Justice, justice." The chant swelled like a storm, breaking its banks louder, fiercer, unstoppable. People stomped the pavement, waved their phones, high live streams blazing across the internet. Every angle captured Price standing firm, Naomi tall behind him, and Dalton shrinking in the space between. It was the second climax, a public crucible. Not only had Dalton been stripped of his authority, he had been rejected by the very brotherhood he thought would shield him. Hayes's voice carried above the chant, calm but final. "Officer Price, stand with her. Protect the law. That's your duty." And in that moment you could feel it, Dalton's last stand, collapsing in real time. The man who had sworn control over the street now looked small, undone, as the truth sealed itself into history. The cameras didn't miss a second. The whole world would see it. Dalton had fought to keep his grip on power, but it slipped anyway because justice had found its voice in the one place he never expected, his own partner. By late afternoon, the crowd had moved from the street to the steps of the federal courthouse. Inside, the air felt cooler, but no less charged. Security scanned badges, reporters whispered into phones, and the echo of shoes on marble sounded like a drum roll. Word had spread there would be an emergency hearing same day. No waiting for Monday, no waiting for anything. I slipped into the back row of a small chamber, already packed beyond comfort. The bench was elevated, clean lines, no ornament except the seal above it. Judge Naomi Carter entered without ceremony, not in a robe, yet just a dark suit that carried its own kind of authority. Captain Hayes took a seat near the well-jaw set. Officer Daniel Price sat behind her, hands laced tight like he didn't trust them to behave. And then Dalton shuffled in face-drawn eyes rimmed with red somewhere between a man daring the room to judge him and a man who knew it already had. The clerk announced the purpose and emergency review of conduct tied to a public stop at Maple and Fifth. No one coughed, no one fidgeted. The room seemed to hold one long breath. They started with the video. Screens flickered to life on both sides of the chamber, and the morning came back to us in color and sound, sirens, sunlight, phones raised. We watched it all again from a dozen angles, Naomi's ID lifted high, the gold seal flashing, Hayes's voice level as a line of statute, Dalton's refusal, his orders piling up like sandbags against a tide. Then the moment no one could ignore the badge, surrendered the gun, laid down, the crowd's chant punching the air. And finally the lunge, the snap of motion toward Naomi and Price, stepping between them like a door slamming shut. If anyone had doubts, the screens didn't. Dalton stared hard at the images, jaw grinding. When the clip ended, he pushed to his feet as if a motor had kicked on inside him. "This is a witch hunt," he said, voice too loud in the still room. "You people saw what you wanted to see. I was doing my job. I was following a lead," the presiding judge said softly. Not harsh, just final. The kind of voice that reminds you where the walls are. Dalton sat. Captain Hayes gave her account short, precise. She identified the mismatched make and plate from the stolen vehicle report, confirmed the credential in her hand was genuine, and stated why she stripped Dalton at the scene, immediate risk to public trust and safety. No heat in it, no performance. It landed like a checklist that ended in a gavel strike. Then they called Officer Price. He stood, and for a second the room saw not a uniform but a young man trying to live with himself. He looked at Naomi, then at the bench. "I've seen Officer Dalton pull over multiple black drivers without cause," he said. "No flourish, no extras." I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place. Today I made my choice. Silence. The kind that makes you notice the hum of the lights. "Why today?" the judge asked. Price swallowed. "Because the truth was standing in cuffs," he said. "And because the camera wasn't the only witness." I was. Dalton slumped, rage leaking out into something smaller, exhaustion maybe, or the first sting of consequence. He tried to speak again, but whatever argument he reached for turned to ash before he could lift it. When it was Naomi's turn, she rose without notes. Her voice filled the room the way light fills a window, not forceful, just impossible to ignore. "What happened at Maple and Fifth," she said, "was not only my humiliation. It was a mirror. It reflected a habit of presuming guilt, of ignoring proof, of protecting power when truth gets inconvenient." She let the words settle, then added, measured and clear, "This is not merely a personal failure. It's a systemic sickness. And if we don't treat the system, it will keep producing the same fevers." No one clapped. This wasn't that kind of room. But shoulders loosened as if people had been waiting all day for someone to name what they'd seen with their own eyes. The presiding judge conferred briefly with counsel, then addressed the chamber. The matter of Dalton's conduct would be referred for federal civil rights investigation. His suspension immediate and public. The footage and radio logs preserved and shared with oversight. A preliminary order drafted to begin mandatory training reforms, written, taught, and enforced. You could feel the shift again, like the street outside had tilted, and now the building did too, toward accountability. Dalton didn't look at anyone when they let him out. He stared at the floor, muttering something only his shoes could hear. On the way to the exit, Price paused at the aisle. He didn't speak to Naomi. He didn't need to. She nodded once, the faintest acknowledgement, a judge accepting testimony she had already known in her bones. When we spilled back into the fading light, the crowd outside caught the headlines as they formed, not just a cop and a judge, not just a traffic stop gone wrong, but a city deciding it wanted better. A personal collision had become a public reckoning, and you could feel it spreading past the courthouse steps into the feeds and living rooms where these battles are won or lost long before a jury is ever sworn. It was no longer just Naomi's story, it was ours. By the next morning, the city felt different, like a window that had finally been opened. Inside the courthouse, the chamber was smaller than the moment deserved, but the gravity fit the room anyway. The counsel filed in with papers already signed, and the hush that followed wasn't uncertainty. It was the edge of an answer. The presiding member cleared his throat and read it plain. No ceremony, no flourish. Officer Mark Dalton was terminated from duty, effective immediately, and referred to the Department of Justice for a federal civil rights investigation. The language was dry as parchment, but it hit like weather, final, unavoidable, larger than one man's temper or one bad stop at a city curb. A murmur rolled across the gallery, not triumph so much as release. We had all been holding our breath since Maple and Fifth. Judge Naomi Carter stood when they invited remarks. She didn't take the lectern. She didn't need it. What happened yesterday, she said, will not be stored away as spectacle. It will be studied. She glanced at the counsel table, then back to the room. This footage, the radio transcripts, the decisions made under pressure, these will become required training for every officer in this jurisdiction. Not as punishment, but as a map how to avoid harm, how to recognize bias, how to choose the law when fear walks in. No one clapped. Again, this wasn't that kind of room, but pens started moving, heads nodded. You could hear the sound of agreement being written down. Captain Laura Hayes rose next. She looked the way a promise looks when it's already cost something. We will establish an independent oversight unit, she said, each word clean as a step on stone. It will have access to body cam footage, dispatch logs, discipline records. It will report publicly. If trust is to be repaired, sunlight can't be optional. It wasn't a speech. It was a plan with a door you could actually walk through. They called on Officer Daniel Price last. He stood palms flat on the table for balance and found his voice without hunting for it. Yesterday, I watched myself choose comfort over duty until I couldn't stand it. He glanced toward Naomi, not for approval, but for courage. Today I choose justice, not complicity. He let the sentence land, then added softer, and I'll choose it again tomorrow. That was the moment I believed the reforms had a chance, not because a council voted, but because a single officer said out loud what so many only think in private. When the session adjourned, the door swung wide and the sound from outside came flooding in cheers that started at the steps and spilled into the street. We moved with the tide until we reached daylight. There must have been hundreds teachers on their lunch break, delivery drivers, idling at the curb, nurses in scrubs still wearing the night's fatigue. Hand-lettered signs rose above the crowd. Phone screens glittered like a constellation in noon sun. Naomi stepped onto the top stair, and the chant caught like a match. Iustina justice. It wasn't angry now. It was steady, almost musical, like a hymn with a drum line. People weren't shouting at someone anymore. They were shouting for something. Hayes joined her on the steps. Price stood a rung or two down, not center stage, exactly where he belonged, visible, accountable, still learning where to put his hands when the world is watching. Naomi didn't wave for quiet. She simply lifted the ID she'd raised the day before and let the crowd see it once more, not as proof against an accusation, but as a symbol of what the law is supposed to be when we refuse to look away. The chant softened to a hum, the kind that sits in your bones. For all the noise, the feeling that stayed with me was simpler alignment. The council's order, Hayes's plan, Price's confession, Naomi's steadiness, the crowd's insistence, they pointed in the same direction for once. Not perfect, not finished, but forward. Someone near me whispered, "We'll see if it holds." It wasn't cynicism, it was experience. And still, when I looked at the steps, the judge, the captain, the rookie, the people, I thought, this is how holding starts. In public, with names, with choices you can replay. The chant swelled again, the word that had carried us from the curb to the courtroom and back into the sun justice. It didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like a beginning. The police academy lecture hall smelled of fresh paint and nervous energy. Rows of cadets in crisp uniforms sat ramrod-straight, notebooks, open pens hovering above the page. Some had the sharp eyes of kids barely out of high school. Others carried the weight of second chances. All of them leaned forward when the door opened and Judge Naomi Carter walked in. She didn't wear robes, only a navy blazer and a simple white blouse. But the room stilled anyway. Authority doesn't always need ceremony. It sometimes walks in quietly, carrying scars instead of symbols. Naomi stood at the lectern, her hands resting on its edge, and for a moment she just looked at them. Then she began, voice steady but threaded with something raw. "I was handcuffed on a public street," she said. The words struck harder for their plainness. Not because I broke a law, but because someone refused to see the truth in my hand. She lifted her palm as if still holding the ID, letting the memory hang there. I carried the Constitution that day, and still I was shackled. The cadets shifted pens frozen mid-sentence. No video clip could match hearing it from her own mouth. Naomi leaned forward, eyes sweeping the room. Some of you believe power is in the weapon you wear. Let me tell you what I learned. Power is not in the gun. Power is not in the badge. Power lives in the justice you choose to protect. Abuse the first two, and you destroy the last. The room was silent except for the scratch of one pen, steady, deliberate. In the back row, Officer Daniel Price sat with his notebook open, writing every word. His uniform looked slightly worn, the edges softened by long days and longer nights. But his posture was different now, upright, intent, as if each line he wrote was a promise. Naomi's eyes found him not to single him out, but to remind the room that change wasn't theoretical. It had a face, a history, a cost. Courage, she said, isn't pulling the trigger. It's stopping the wrong before it becomes irreversible. Sometimes it means standing against your own partner. Sometimes it means saying out loud what everyone else whispers. That is what this uniform asks of you. A ripple went through the cadets. They knew about Price. They had seen his testimony, his choice on Maple and Fifth. To watch him now scribbling fiercely in the corner of a classroom was to see living proof that redemption could wear the same uniform as guilt. Naomi closed her notebook, but not her conviction. Remember this, she said. The day you forget the Constitution is the day you stop being an officer. The moment you turn away from truth, you've already lost more than your badge. You've lost your nation's trust. The silence that followed was heavy, not awkward, but reverent. Then, almost as one, the cadets lowered their heads and wrote again, pens racing to keep up with the weight of the words. Outside the academy, the world kept turning. News outlets ran the headline, "Former Officer Dalton indicted on federal civil rights charges." His face, once tight with arrogance, now looked hollow, a man staring down years in prison. The irony cut sharp. The very law he tried to twist now held him fast. At the same time, another story rose. Captain Laura Hayes appointed to lead Reform Division. The city's newspapers framed it as progress, cautious but real. Hayes herself dismissed the praise. Reform is never finished, she told a reporter. It's built one choice at a time. But inside the academy, no headline mattered more than the sight of Naomi Carter standing at the front of the class. Not a victim replaying her humiliation, but a teacher transforming it into warning, into wisdom, into fuel. Price lifted his eyes, once catching hers. He didn't speak, but his gaze carried the weight of what he had promised on the street. I choose justice. Not complicity. And she nodded just once, as if to say, then live it. The cadets would graduate in months. They would patrol streets where suspicion and fear still lived. But now they carried something else with them, a story, a reminder, a legacy. Naomi ended the session the way she had begun, without flourish, without drama. I was handcuffed once, she said, voice calm, almost quiet. But dignity cannot be chained. Remember that, and you will serve this country well. The room didn't applaud. They didn't need to. The silence itself was respect. As they filed out, I thought about the boy on the sidewalk, who'd asked why a judge could be tied like a criminal. Maybe one day, when one of these cadets makes the right choice in the heat of duty, that boy will see the answer. From a moment of humiliation had grown a living legacy, a story carried not in books but in people in uniforms, in voices that chose courage over silence, and that more than punishment or policy was how justice turned into something that lasts. The morning light spilled across the federal courthouse, washing the stone steps in gold. Inside, Judge Naomi Carter stood alone in her chambers. The black robe hung heavy on her shoulders, familiar as armor. She smoothed the collar at her throat, fingertips pressing against the white fabric until it lay perfectly flat. For a heartbeat, she paused in front of the mirror, studying her reflection. It wasn't vanity, it was recognition. The eyes that looked back carried both pride and weight, the pride of surviving humiliation without bowing, and the weight of knowing that her dignity now belonged to more than just herself. Behind her, the door cracked open. Marcus, her longtime clerk, leaned in, voice low. Judge Carter, he said, the council is assembled. They're waiting. She gave a single nod, no wasted movement. Her hands slid once down the folds of the robe, smoothing the fabric into order. Then she turned, walking with the measured pace of someone who knows every step matters. The double doors opened, and the hum of the courtroom washed over her. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters adjusted microphones, officers lined the walls in uneasy silence. But when Naomi entered the room stilled, she ascended the bench, her presence filling the chamber long before her words did. She set her hands on the wood, leaned forward slightly, and spoke the phrase that had anchored every session she'd ever led. "This court is now in session." Her voice rang steady, unshaken, carrying the memory of the street where she had been chained and the promise of the justice that had freed her. For a moment, silence stretched. Not emptiness, anticipation. The kind of silence that says the system may have stumbled, but today it will stand again. Naomi scanned the room, eyes sharp but not unkind. She knew what they were all thinking, that the law had cracked, that its trust had splintered. And she also knew the truth worth saying out loud. "The system is not perfect," she began. "It is built by people, and people fail. But our strength is not in pretending otherwise. Our strength is in admitting those failures, correcting them, and demanding better of ourselves." The words weren't lofty, but they landed deep. Lawyers shifted in their seats. Officers lowered their eyes. Even the reporters paused, pens hovering midair, as if the line itself deserved a moment of silence. She continued, calm but firm. "Justice does not sleep. It does not vanish when an officer forgets his oath or when fear blinds judgment. Justice is awake in every witness who refuses to look away, in every officer who chooses truth over silence, and in every community that insists on accountability. That is what gives this court its authority, not robes, not walls, but the people who believe in its promise." Outside, beyond the tall windows, a crowd had gathered again. Hundreds pressed against the barricades, not with anger this time, but with expectation. Some held signs. Others carried nothing but the quiet conviction of their presence. Children sat on shoulders, elders stood with folded arms, and the chant rose again, softer but stronger, for it justice. Naomi let the sound carry into the chamber, a reminder that the law was never sealed behind doors. It lived wherever people demanded it. She lifted her gavel, then paused, eyes flicking once more across the faces before her. "Let us proceed," she said, her tone less command than invitation. "Because the promise of justice is not what we declare, it is what we do. The gavel struck once sharp as a heartbeat, and just like that, the day's work began, not a spectacle, not a replay, but the quiet, unending task of a system still learning to heal itself. As she leaned back in her chair, Naomi Carter understood the truth that had carried her through humiliation and into history. The fight for justice never ends, but neither does its possibility. Outside, the crowd shifted, voices rising, not in fury, but in faith. Their chant wove through the city streets, through live stream feeds, through whispered conversations at kitchen tables. Justice never sleeps. And for the first time in a long time, people believed it. And that's where this chapter ends, but its lesson keeps echoing. Justice isn't flawless yet. It lives as long as we have the courage to face failure and choose what's right. Judge Naomi Carter's stand reminds us that dignity can't be chained, and truth will always outlast fear. If this story moved you, please hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful stories that shine a light on courage, justice, and humanity. Your support means more than numbers. It's what gives our team the strength to keep creating stories that matter. Remember this symbol, Mr. Mac's Stories, where every tale carries the heartbeat of justice.